Okay, we've made it to the final straw, the election of 1860. I think you can already tell from our election map here that this is kind of a mess. We're going to end up with four major candidates running. And so that's going to be one of the big reasons that Mr. Lincoln wins this election. All right, let's do some context. So remember, the Republican Party, relatively new party on the scene, formed in 1854. They're grabbing up all of these remnants of the Whig Party, especially the conscience Whigs, Whigs that didn't agree with slavery. There's a smattering of know-nothings in here, Free Soilers. Remember that the precursor for the Free Soilers was the Liberty Party, the more extreme of the two. But so Liberty Party dissolves, becomes the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers are a major component of the Republican Party. They are going to run John C. Fremont their first time out in 1856, and they very nearly win. But they don't quite get this highest office in the land, but they do get some more name recognition and are really seen as a major party. We've got two front runners for the convention between William Seward of New York and Abraham Lincoln. Now, obviously, before we get to this point, there's a lot more names in the mix, upwards of 10 to 12 of them. But eventually it gets whittled down. Of course, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are going to help tremendously here. Democratic Party, in the meantime, is a disaster. They're in total shambles. They are going to be running two different candidates. So there's going to be a Northern Democratic candidate and a Southern Democratic candidate. So that's a bit of a mess. So the Southern Democrats are going to run John Breckinridge. He had been James Buchanan's VP. Stephen Douglas is going to be the front runner for the Northern Democrats. But when they have their convention, the Southern Democrats are going to walk out in protest because he won't pledge to expand slavery, because remember, he is the architect of popular sovereignty. So because they walk out, there's no quorum, so he can't get the required amount of votes. So they just call it a wash. So they end the convention. They'll have to do another convention 2 months later, and then he will just barely get enough votes to get the nomination. And then we have this new party, Constitutional Union Party. So this is, again, made up of kind of a motley crew here of disgruntled Democrats, know-nothings, and the slave-holding Whigs who were unwilling to join either of the two major parties we have going right now. So they are going to nominate a slaveholder. So that is John Bell. Governor Sam Houston of Texas was in the mix there as well, but they opt for Mr. Bell. So he's a former Whig who had been a very loud opposer to the Lecompton Constitution and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So they are going to be calling themselves the party of law. They are really going to be using this idea that they are the party of the Constitution. They're going to kind of renege on saying much of anything on what they believe about slavery or states' rights, but they're just going to go with what the Constitution says at this point. So really, they're just looking to drain off votes from those in the Democratic Party that are not satisfied with Mr. Douglas. Lincoln's platform, you can see, is free soil, denouncing extremists like John Brown, who wants a higher tariff. And you can see that he's going to slowly but surely be changing his views on slavery. He's going to go a long way between his platform in 1860 on slavery and saying, let's just let it be where it is now, and we just won't expand it, to the Emancipation Proclamation a bit later. So the results of the election, voter turnout is quite high. The only other election where it will be higher is in 1876. So 82% is pretty darn high. On a quote unquote good year of an election, you're looking at more between 40 and 50%. Lincoln is going to get more than the required electoral votes that he needs because he's going to be carrying the northern states. And the northern states have a higher population, and ergo, they have more electoral votes. So that's going to be the major reason why he wins in 1860. He will not carry one single southern state, one of the very few presidents where that is true. But it should be noted that there are 10 states where his name doesn't even appear on the ballot. So that could be one reason. Douglas was really not a serious contender. He only ends up getting 12 electoral votes. So he really only carries one state. Southern vote is going to be split between Bell and Breckinridge. Again, a major reason why Lincoln will win, because that vote was split. His election is going to trigger secession, especially in South Carolina. It's like the second they find out that Lincoln has won, then they announce that they are seceding. So this is a really important piece of evidence from this time period. This is where South Carolina will get the nickname of the hellhole of secession. To some extent, this is just an extension of the nullification crisis under Jackson. So now Lincoln has found himself elected, but he's walking into a interesting and very precarious situation. So keep in mind that the results from the election are coming out in November, December, but with the way that inaugurations work in 1860, he's not going to take the office until March. So he's got 3 months just to kind of watch these southern states walk away from the Union. So he's going to start having to, get some plans in order. And so he really only has 3 options here. So he can compromise on this slavery question. He can let the South go in peace. Well, there's some problematic pieces of that if you have another foreign country within this particular continent, or he can use force. But again, just keeping in mind, he hasn't even been inaugurated yet. He should have time to celebrate this great achievement, but unfortunately, he's not able to do that. But one of the most fascinating things about Lincoln is that in the way in which he forms his cabinet. So his cabinet becomes known as a team of rivals. So he wasn't afraid to ask someone like Stephen Douglas, William Seward, people that he had gone toe-to-toe with over the years to help him out in this regard. So he has one of the better presidential cabinets in presidential history for that reason. So he really does get a nice mix of viewpoints in his cabinet. Okay, so now you have this very complete timeline on your hands, but let's summarize. What are the major causes of the Civil War? The number one absolutely has to be slavery and those connected issues. So how it was being extended. When we see federal interference, we see these compromises, we see the federal government getting involved in the Fugitive Slave Act and things like that. And of course, the moral question. The nature of the Union. This is more of a long range question here as well. Are we a compact of states, or are we an indivisible federal union? If we are a compact of states, then nullification is valid, secession is valid. But if it's an indivisible federal union, that is an illegal act. So that's something that we're going to be kind of grappling with during the Civil War. Sectional political parties are definitely reflecting this, especially when you look at your Constitutional Union Party and the fact that we've got 2 different worlds in this country, and we have for a while. We have the static, relatively unchanging aristocratic South. So this is the South of slavery and plantations, whereas you have the economic powerhouse in the North with this very dynamic and strong economy, a very diverse population, so very different from the South. And you've got extremists, you've got extreme abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown that aren't afraid to espouse violence. And you've got secessionists also being willing to espouse violence when you look at the caning of Sumner at the hands of Preston Brooks. And probably one of the most devastating points of this is the death of the great triumvirate. We had these great collaborators, these great compromisers in Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. Important that they are each representing a different section of the country. So at least in one small way, each section could be represented in these compromises. You've got Henry Clay of the West, as it was at the time, so Kentucky being the West. You've got Daniel Webster from the North in Massachusetts, and you've got John C. Calhoun in the South from South Carolina. Now, I know it's easy to look at Calhoun as kind of a troublemaker, especially when you look at his time during the Jackson years, but it is important to note that these 3 were willing to work together and did quite often. The people that really pick up the mantle for them when these men die in the 1850s are definitely kind of the B or the C team that we're looking at here. The Stephen Douglases, they can try to create compromises, but not to the effect that these 3 did. And the ineffectiveness of James Buchanan. Now, obviously, you can lay this blame at the feet of a lot of presidents because this particular can just kept getting kicked on down the road, but the road kind of ends eventually with James Buchanan, and he does very little to stem the tide of all of these sectional squabbles. He really leaves it up to Congress when it's very possible that he could have stepped in as the executive and outlawed slavery or not outlawed slavery, but he could have taken some executive actions, which he just did not. Final piece I'd like you to do with this is take a look at this very full timeline that you have now and decide where you think the point of no return was. You know, where was the point when it was inevitable that this was going to come to war? Was it the caning of Sumner on the Senate floor? Was it John Brown? Was it Bleeding Kansas? So you decide. So this is a good practice in utilizing your evidence. On the rest of your document, you'll see an optional link there for Ken Burns' Civil War series. I highly recommend that you take a look at this episode if you have the time. Really great info and documentation by Mr. Burns.